great pleasure and privilege to introduce Dr. Stephen Krebs, the retired director of the David G. Leach Research Station of the Holden Arboretum, and Connor Ryan, the Rhododendron Collections Curator for the Holden Arboretum. Steve received his PhD from Michigan State University in plant breeding and genetics slash horticulture. He has held adjunct appointments at Iowa State University and Ohio State University. Steve managed the Holden Arboretum David G. Leach Research Station, which is a satellite facility maintained for horticultural research on a 30-acre property in Madison, Ohio. Steve followed David Leach's commitment to breed superior rhododendrons and azaleas for continental climates, i.e., cold winters and hot summers. Other traits, such as resistance to Phytophthora, root rot disease, and high pH tolerance, were more recent program goals. Steve's most current research focused on the predisposing effects of environmental stress, things like high temperature and flooding, and the effects they have on root rot disease development in rhododendrons, and the identification of a species from Taiwan that is able to maintain Phytophthora disease resistance. Steve has a number of publications to his credit, many dealing with disease resistance and cold hardiness. And now, Steve Krebs and rhododendron breeding in the Midwest, a 70-year odyssey. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Teresa. And now it should be my pleasure to, this is a tag team talk. So I'm going to take about half the time, and Connor Ryan will follow me. And so I want to talk about Connor. And let's see here. Okay. So Connor arrived at Holden in, was it spring 2019, I think. And he was fresh from graduate school at the University of Georgia, where he got a master's degree in their landscape plants program. So he's very knowledgeable about all kinds of garden plants, and especially woody plants. Connor has family roots in the north in Pennsylvania, but he grew up in Mississippi. And so he's a Southerner, and we'll see if he really can adapt to Ohio winters or not. That's another stress test we're conducting. Anyway, I'll get it. We'll try to, we'll probably talk for under an hour, and we'll have time for questions, and I'm not, as much time as you want, you'll have us here this evening. So let's see, I got to share my screen. Let's see here.
Green spot in the bottom of the screen, yep.
There, and blow that up. There. Okay, great. Yes, rhododendron breeding in the Midwest, 70-year odyssey. So this is going to be either a really long talk or a very kind of a general talk, and I think it's going to be more of a general talk. I want to discuss a little bit about David Leach and some of the lesser known aspects of his breeding program, and a bit about disease resistance, and then Connor's going to talk about other topics, perhaps a little bit about pH tolerance and rhododendron collections at Holden Arboretum. So just to orient you, here's a map of Ohio's fabulous northeast coast with Lake Erie along the shoreline. And these stars represent key elements of what's now called Holden Forests and Gardens. So down here in the yellow is metropolitan Cleveland, and that star there indicates the Cleveland Botanical Garden, which merged with Holden some years ago. And the middle star is the main campus at Holden in Kirtland, Ohio. It's about a 3,500 acre campus. And then furthest out here on the right, sort of at the edge of the Holden's empire, is the Leach Research Station, which was, of course, founded by David and was brought into Holden's portfolio in the late 1980s. So there are two, both the main campus at Kirtland and the Leach Station are large rhododendron collections. Down at the main campus, you have the Helleness Layer Garden, which is about the same size as the Leach Station, almost 30 acres with well over 2,000 accessioned rhododendrons and azaleas. And it's especially, I think the most distinguishing aspect of it is it has almost a complete collection of Tony Chamarello's hybrids. I don't really know of any other garden that has that extensive a collection. And both of them are kind of woodland gardens, as you can see, which is a really lovely way to view and grow rhododendrons. Well, David G. Leach, hopefully most of you had the opportunity to meet him. He was quite a character and really one of the foundational figures in American rhododendron awareness and culture. So he was, of course, a hybridizer. He started in Western Pennsylvania and Brookville, and then moved to the Madison site in about early 1970s, bringing most of his collection with him. And known for breeding cold hardy plants. That was kind of his niche as a breeder. And over maybe 50 years of breeding, he selected over 2,000 plants, which are currently in the holdings at the Leach Station. About 80, well, including azaleas, about 80 of them are named varieties. Perhaps as much as his impact as a breeder, he was really influential as a writer. I think one of the best writers about rhododendrons. His book, Rhododendrons of the World, is a classic, and just the introduction chapter is really kind of brings just the romance of the plants to him. And when you're around David, you really felt like you were onto something special by being involved with rhododendrons. And also just a public advocate of the plants. He was president of the American Horticulture Society, of course, president of ARS for a number of years, and also involved in the Garden Conservancy, which is an organization that preserves mainly kind of key estate gardens. There's some of his hybrids here. Of course, in the middle, his yellow Capistrano, which he considered to be one of his finest accomplishments in the yellow group. A sibling of Red River on the left is Red Sea. Just a really nice late blooming red. All right, and so when I think of David's plants, I think of really clear, bright colors and a cold hardy background. His criteria for hardiness was zone 5. So they would be bud hardy to -15 Fahrenheit. That was kind of his minimum threshold. And plants, of course, the vegetative parts could be much hardier. And he certainly had a lot of those conditions in Brookville, which is colder site than Madison. And currently, with climate change and being located in a little milder climate along the lake, we don't see -15 very often. And maybe once in a decade. And I think in the 30 years I've been here, we've only seen -20 twice. But we had a record low in 2015, -22, and that it was very reassuring to see that most of David's collection did quite well. So really, it's hardier than bud hardier than they're typically represented in the literature. So that's good to know, and it's really a unique base of plants to work with. So these are named ones I like a lot. Samoa, the red, one called Swan's Down, which is an early white. The Spring Herald, which is a Fictolactium hybrid, large leafed, very early. And a yellow one, which I don't think was introduced, called Savannah, which is a great truss and a kind of so-so plant. One thing I liked about David's program was his his focus on or inclusion of really late blooming material. And one of my favorites is this hybrid called Summer Snow, which is has some maximum in it, which contributes to lateness, and also auriculatum, an Asian species, which is large leafed and also late blooming. So he combined those traits in a hardy background. And this is just a gorgeous plant. If you have room for it, it's gonna get big. I think it's probably the biggest clone at the research station, probably getting up to close to 20 feet, which is an unusually big plant for our climate. And I like the cool white color, which appears sort of in early July. And then one of the progenies of Summer Snow, it was crossed with a variety called Scarlet Blast and produced Summer Glow, which isn't quite as late blooming, but of course it has a lot more color. I would say it's a mid-June bloomer in our climate. Both really nice plants, and I think you can find them in the trade still. Another aspect of David's program was his early interest in orange flowers. And we, of course, had very good records of his crosses. They were all digital when I arrived. So we see them going back to the early 1950s. And that's when he was kind of making his foundational, what I call primary crosses. And he was using his sources of hardiness over here on the left, a white form of Catabiense, of course, maximum, things like Russell Harmon, which is maximum crossed with Catabiense, and then crossing it with all these orange things. So these were cultivars that were in existence. Many of them originated in England, I believe, but they involved dichroanthum, shown up here. This is an Asian species from Western Yunnan. As you can see in the picture, it's quite orange. It has these kind of loose trusses, but very waxy flowers. So here he's crossing it with Francis Hanger, who was he was the head gardener for at Exbury Estate, employed by Mr. Rothschild. I don't know about Edward Dunn. Fabia is an old English hybrid, and so is Goldsworth Orange. So he made those in the early 50s, and then he basically bred with them extensively for the next 40 years. And here's some varieties that came from those first crosses. You're probably not familiar with all of them, but maybe you know things like Bali or Hindustan and Capistrano. All right, so in our looking at his crossing records, we can determine that almost a third out of the 3,000 crosses on record have dichroanthum lineage, which is really a huge contribution to the genetics of the collection. I mean, outside of Catabiense, I think this dichroanthum is the second most common species that David used, specifically for orange and yellows. Now, he used other yellow species like Wardii and Campylocarbum, but not nearly to this extent. So here's one of my favorite plants. It's kind of an informal truss, but in a nice sort of I would call it a pastel tangerine called Borneo. And it's a Catabiense, white form of Catabiense crossed with this dichroanthum hybrid here. And then again, in the foreground here is Bali, which is very nice. It's again, it's a white form called Powell Glass of Catabiense crossed with this other hybrid that has Myriaflorum dichroanthum and Fortunei discolor in it. And very fine foliage, and lots of the offsprings from these crosses were some were yellow, some were orange, and then there are a lot of yellows with these, or pinks rather, salmon pinks with these yellow highlights, which I find a really beautiful color. In the background is a variety called Tuscany of David's. And so down through the years there, he selected many plants from these crosses, and only a small portion of them were named. So here's a group of unnamed hybrids at the station tracing back to dichroanthum. So you can see the kind of range of colors he achieved. This one in the lower right does have a name, although it was never introduced. It's called Arizona, and it is a cross with Burma as one of the parents. And Burma, as you probably know, is a really dark red, and it's a sprawling plant. So this plant is upright, reasonably well formed, and it has a sort of a pale yellow truss. When you cross with Burma, you get a very well-formed truss, that's for sure. You just have to work against the plant habit to correct for that. All right, so as I mentioned, that David was breeding early on with Katabiense using white forms. So what he and a number of other breeders at that time, including Joe Gable and Guy Nearing, were concerned about was they wanted the hardiness of Katabiense, but they wanted to avoid that kind of blued out pink, whether you call it pinkish purple or purplish pink. They wanted to get those pigments out of it. So in the late 1930s, a plant was discovered by a Virginian named Powell Glass from Lynchburg, who was out fishing, I guess, and he saw a sport, a white flowering sport of Katabiense. And he tagged it and went back and collected it and propagated it, and then gave seeds to Joe Gable, who grew those on and made some selections, including one called Katabiense var album Glass, which when you make kind of a portmanteau of those words, it's Catalgla. So that was really one of the foundational plants in Dave's program. I mean, he did use other white Katabiense species, but Catalgla was the main one. And there's some problems involved with that. You can see in this greenhouse potted plant picture how pure white the flowers are. There's no, not even an obvious pollination nectar guide. There's no flare or spotting. And so that was good as far as Dave was concerned, because he wanted to get clear colors, crossing reds and yellows onto something like that. But the plant performance in the field is really, I think, subpar. So it's difficult to root, and it has, I would say, below average vigor in the field. This is probably a 10-year-old plant right here, and you can see how kind of well, skimpy it is, really. It's not retaining its older foliage, and just it hasn't grown much. And the foliage can be problematic. We'll see a lot of marginal yellowing or necrosis. And it seems to carry through into many of the offspring. So that's a problem there. I think, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think Dave was aware maybe of some of these issues, but really valued the floral contribution maybe more than the vegetative part. And that, you know, with the benefit of hindsight, I think that was maybe a bad trade-off. So when you think about, you know, how to make like a commercial rhododendron, something that's, you know, going to have appeal beyond collectors and a wide presence, maybe sort of national rather than just regional, you really need to think about form and function. So form, of course, are all the things that we grow the plants for, the ornamental traits, and the function are kind of the hidden traits that make the plant, you know, a good performer, a good doer. And those are things like tolerance of temperature extremes, moisture extremes, alkaline soils, salts, diseases, insects, and so forth. And really, up until relatively recently, the only common functional trait that breeders addressed was cold hardiness. I mean, many, not just in the US, but in Europe as well. And there really was significant improvement in developing a rich palette of ornamental traits into the cold hardy background, but very little on these other traits. And early on, when I was thinking about how to kind of leverage David's plant collection, which was enriched for hardiness already, into something even more broadly adaptable, I kind of got interested in disease resistance because I had a background in that as a student, and there were some serious problems involved in the rhododendron world. And the most common one, which you all are aware of, is the root rot disease caused by Phytophthora cinnamoni, which is a global soil pathogen. It probably originated somewhere in Southeast Asia, but has since traveled all over the world through human activity. And I consider it just ubiquitous. So this is what the disease looks like. On the left is a healthy seedling with a nice white fibrous root system. And over here on the right, you have a root system that's been really just invaded by the pathogen. The roots, it enters through fine roots and kind of works its way up into the crown. So all these sort of rusty brown necrotic roots. And you can even see around the crown region, there's been some girdling of the bark, and it's sometimes called crown rot as well as root rot. So of course we don't see this part when we're looking at a plant in the field, but we do see above ground these common wilting symptoms, which occur once the pathogen has really colonized the crown region. It just destroys the vascular system. And since the plant's under water stress, it produces this wilting, which is irreversible. I mean, pouring more water on the plant is not, it's actually going to make the problem worse, but it won't recover from that. And so early on, when I was looking at this, there was fortunately some literature about resistance within the genus, within cultivars and species. And it was done by two professors at Ohio State, Harry Hoytink and Fritz Schmidhenner, who I was able to meet with, and kind of they consulted me on this project and made some suggestions, particularly with how to do the pathology work. And on the list of plants that they discovered as resistant, there was Caroline and the Gable hybrid and Chamarello's rocket. And then in my own tests, I determined that Melquist's, Ingrid Melquist was highly resistant as well. So these are some plants that I used probably in the 1990s for breeding for resistance. And Ingrid Melquist in particular has been the best one, I think. It's not particularly fertile, so you have to work with it to get seed, but we've had some fine results from it. The other plant that Hoytink and Schmidhenner identified for resistance was the species Hyperethrum. I mean, there were other species as well that they looked at that were resistant, but this one I think is the best in terms of hardiness and in terms of being a plant that would be good for the nursery trade. That would make a good container plant. You see it here growing as a container. It has great foliage and it grows fast. It's very floriferous, so the blooms can almost cover the plant, kind of like an evergreen azalea. And it's hardy to zone 6, so we can grow it outside in Ohio. Although if it gets down to -8 to -10 Fahrenheit, the buds will get zapped, but the rest of the plant will be okay. It's heat tolerant down to zone 9, so the Gulf South, So it's really something we felt we could breed with. It has a little bit of the flowers are a little lax, the truss, but that can be corrected with. So it's really just a matter of crossing this species with things that have more color saturation, a little bit more hardiness, and a well-formed truss to try to correct for those traits and get new resistant varieties. And at the time I was thinking about rhododendron hyperethrum in terms of disease resistance, I heard a talk, I think it was in Williamsburg by John Thornton, who was talking about his heat tolerance program in Franklinton, Louisiana. And he was using hyperethrum for that mainly. And so I went down to visit with him and saw his nursery, which was pushed to top a nursery, I think it was called. Picture of it here. This was after Katrina, and I had to say it was just it's sort of minimally kept up, and you know, the plants make it or don't on their own. What I call extreme gardening. And John was so he'd been working with hyperethrum maybe 30 years already. So he was a wealth of information and gave me some plants to help get me started. And this is one of his hybrids here called Peppermint Twist, which I think Briggs propagated for a number of years. And some of his other plants have since been incorporated into the Southgate brand of rhododendrons produced by Plant Development Services Incorporated, PDSI, in Alabama. They're the folks that do the Encore azaleas. So we were kind of interested in developing plants in Ohio, starting them off in Ohio, making selections and then moving them down south for trials down there, working with PDSI and Buddy Lee. And of course, John was always around nearby to talk to. In addition to heat tolerance and disease resistance, hyperethrum is also pretty resistant, really tolerant of wet feet. So we did these flooding stress trials about 10 years ago, where we put in various known susceptible and resistant plants, and also hyperethrum and some of our experimental hybrids. And as you can see on the left here, we had planned to irrigate it with a kind of controlled flooding, but we had so much rain that year that Mother Nature took over the flooding regime. And we probably had 10 to 11 episodes of flooding and draining throughout the summer. And you can see most of the plants like that. They're dead, they're yellow, so forth. Here's hyperethrum on the right here, looking pretty happy at the end of the season. So typically flooding predisposes plants to disease, even if they have some resistance, but that was not so much the case with hyperethrum. And that's good because, as we found out later, growing plants in Louisiana, and you'd have these torrential rains. I mean, one year they had 30 inches of rain in 3 days. Some of those plants have held up pretty well in the field. It's also now how we do our screenings for resistance. Initially, we started out on the advice of Doctors Hoytink and Schmidhenner to do controlled inoculations in the lab. We would culture the pathogen and then inoculate plants in the greenhouse. But the problem with that is that we would get sort of some false negatives. So some of the plants coming out of there that we selected as resistance, once we moved into the field, they didn't do so well. So we thought it would be better just to inoculate them right out in the field, because we're adding all these other stresses. In addition to the disease, we have full sunlight, just a more stressful condition than the greenhouse. Plus we could flood them. So in this particular year, we have flats with about 4,000 seedlings from breeding populations being inoculated. It's about 2 days of flooding, and then pull those flats out and just set them on the ground for the remainder of the summer. And 2 months later, you can see how they sort it out with survivors and well, losers and winners anyway. So we pull the survivors out and then grow those on to flowering so we can see, judge them for ornamental traits. So currently we have one cultivar from the hyperethrum breeding program that's in the trade. It's or what I call it from our southern program. It's a variety trade named Splendor. It's a cross of Henry's Red with hyperethrum, first generation cross, and it's being offered through PDSI as part of the Southgate Rhododendron brand. I think we've had it at a few sales, and it's kind of making its way into the trade slowly. I think there's been some issues with tissue culture, and also, I think just the rhododendrons in the Gulf South are still kind of a new thing. It's not high in the public consciousness yet, but we hope that it will become that way. And certainly is a very suitable plant for the mid-Atlantic and the Southeast. I mean, it would just do fine there, I hope. Although I need to ask the Moores about the Splendor that they bought at the Potomac meeting that I went to a couple of years ago. So that's, I just want to say in terms of breeding for adaptive traits, there's a few aspects that are really key. I mean, you have to find some source material, either species or cultivars that have the traits you want. I mean, you can find that certainly for hardiness and root rot resistance. Something like, could you find a drought tolerant species or variety? I think maybe there are probably fewer options there for that particular kind of trait. The trait has to be heritable. In other words, when you breed with it, you have to be able to pass the trait from the parent onto the offspring. And you need large populations, really thousands of plants, because you're going to be really weeding out, selecting at very low levels, maybe 10 to 20% survivors at the most. You have to have a good screening method. Take example, cold hardiness. For most people, you have to wait for a good winter. And that's, well, currently in Madison, that's kind of hit or miss. So that's not the optimal method, but inoculation for disease resistance is a very reliable and effective method. Multiple sites are great. We are using 3 sites, one in Madison, one at the main campus, and Louisiana. And the more you can do, the better, particularly if you want the plant to go out as something suitable for gardens across the country. And of course, you need time, at least 10 years for research and development. And then you add on to that the time it needs to be evaluated by a nursery. That's sort of a propagation and production tests. So with that, I think I'll pause and let Connor kick in. So take it away, Connor.
All right. Thanks a lot, Steve. Okay.
Sure.
Like maybe you have to share your. Let's see.
What do I have to do?
I think you have to.
Okay, stop share. Okay.
Yeah.
Good?
Okay. Yeah, I think we're good. Okay. All right. Yeah. So I was fortunate to overlap with Steve. So actually 2 days ago was my 2-year Holden anniversary. So I've been in East Ohio for 2 years and really learning about rhododendrons for 2 years. I think I'm still a bit green with rhododendrons, but I have this job where I spend, every waking hour of my workday thinking about rhododendrons. And so I think I've been able to get somewhat up to speed. And with Steve's retirement, we've been thinking about what's next for rhododendron at Holden. And of course, we have the leaf station where we're going to continue the breeding program. But with my hiring, Holden has really decided to go all in on rhododendron collections. So I don't have as much of a research expectation as Steve, but I'm very much dedicated to the collections of rhododendrons across all three campuses at Holden. And so I just like to talk about some of these current interests. Some of these are kind of bleed over from what Steve was working on, and some of them are more of what I'm interested in moving forward. This plant here is Maud Corning, which is Holden Arboretum's maybe most significant plant introduction. It's a Dexter hybrid, and it was part of the initial batch of plants sent to Holden Arboretum in 1940 that became really the start of our rhododendron collection. It's this incredibly fragrant, large flowered Dexter fortune type hybrid. But I also want to talk about, so I'll talk about our collections, and I'll talk about some other little projects with grafting and then some plant introductions. So with the Holden plant collection, it's big, maybe even too big. I think sometimes I look at our collection and say maybe it's gotten a little out of hand, but we have nearly 1,900 plants in the collection at present, excluding most of the breeders' collection of leech hybrids at the station. And those plants are comprised of about 750 different types of cultivars and species and unique selections, and then 54 unique species within that collection. So it's a big group of plants to look after. And throughout our history, it's really been garden plants. That's what the focus has been. Because of course we have David Leach, which is intertwined with the Arboretum's history. But on either side of David, we had Tony Chamarello to his west and Peter Gerard to his east, developing other locally adapted rhododendrons. And those all, maybe by virtue of their nurseries just being right down the road from the Arboretum, all of their plants ended up in our collection. As Steve alluded to, we have an exceptional collection of Chamarello hybrids, 42 unique Chamarello selections. The Gerards, we have 30. Most of these are his evergreen azaleas, which are quite popular still today. You can go to a garden center and buy multiple different types of Gerard selections. Of course, a ton of leech hybrids. And then other key players in the rhododendron world. Weston Nurseries with their azaleas and also rhododendrons, PJM, Joe Gable, the Waterers at Knapp Hill, Charles Dexter. So we just have this huge collection of garden type hybrids in the rhododendron collection. And here's some of those plants. This is Gerard's Caitlin, which is Peter Gerard Jr.'s last azalea selection, I think from 2006. One that all of the older Gerards have gotten around, but this is a newer one that I don't see a lot. But it's awesome. It's got these apple blossom pink and white flowers. Tony Chamarello's Yaku Prince that we got straight from Tony's nursery. Yaku Prince is probably his most famous or most commercially available hybrid, and you still see it around today. Steve showed Holden's Spring Herald, which is a leech hybrid, and it's dwarfed. It's really dwarfed in front of this Japanese cedar, but it's a huge, awesome plant that Steve introduced in the early 2010s. Other plants like Francesca that we got from Bald Hill Nurseries, which introduced it. Just an awesome red. Coccinia speciosa, which is a Ghent hybrid that our first director got in Holland, which is cool. It's one of the oldest plants in our collection. And then we have, this is a Chamarello hybrid called Bessie Howells. And it was introduced in 1961, and then Holden's, what would become our main rhododendron garden, the Helen S. Layer Garden, was started in 1964. And so this is one of the original plants in that garden. Still hanging around, maybe a little rangy, but it doesn't matter so much when it's in bloom. And moving forward, we're thinking about trying to build, we have this great garden collection, but what else could we use our collections for? And so we're interested in building these higher quality scientific and conservation collections. And that really starts with wild occurring plants. For example, we have Rhododendron McKenoi, which is really a great plant. This is really the best one at Holden, and it's at the leach station with those incredibly narrow leaves. Just an awesome plant. And we've been using the Rhododendron Red List as a guide. And for those of you who are familiar with it, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature compiled a list of basically all known rhododendrons. It's more than 1,100 taxa, and gave them an assessment for conservation concern. And so rhododendron makinoi was assigned vulnerable. We have plants like rhododendron greenlandicum, which is not would be considered least concern on the red list, but it's special to Ohio because we have 5 native rhododendrons to Ohio, including rhododendron greenlandicum, and we're at the southern end of its range. And actually the state of Ohio says it's been extirpated, so it doesn't exist in Ohio anymore, except we have wild collected greenlandicum from Ohio in our collection. And so it's things like this where conservation is important, because if it doesn't exist in Ohio, we at least have Ohio origin plants hanging around in our collection that could potentially be used for conservation, or at least to tell people the story that we're losing plants and we need to be a little more careful and pay attention to what's happening around us. And so we've been making trips, just starting really, to acquire wild origin plants. We have 3 azalea species native to Ohio. In Northeast Ohio, we have Prinophyllum and Paraclymenoides. And so 2 years ago, we went to a site about in the next county over from Holden Arboretum to collect. And actually, so Prinophyllum and Paraclymenoides both grow there, and they actually hybridize. And so we have a bunch of seedlings growing, and we don't really know what they are. So we're just waiting for them to bloom, and then we'll be able to ID them. This past fall, I went to Dolly Sods in West Virginia to collect mini bush, which is one of these red listed species. It's red listed because it's listed as data deficient, because mini bush, Rhododendron pilosum, used to be a Menziesea. And so until recently, it wasn't even considered a rhododendron, but it's recently been grouped in that group. And there's these like yellow patches that tend to be mini bush. It could be something else too, but it has exceptional fall color. If you look at this plant here, and it has this distinct tip. In leaf, you can tell it apart from other rhododendrons and azaleas from this, the tip, the mucro, that's very pointed and yellow. But a nice plant and endemic to the Appalachian Mountains, and worth preserving and studying in garden collections. And then moving forward, we're going to try to really push the limits. As Steve mentioned, the leach station is kind of this special site. I've talked to some nurserymen who have told me that the leach hybrids themselves only grow well in Madison at Leach's Place, and it's because we have these really sandy soils and this moderate temperature because we're so close to Lake Erie. And so I think there's potential to use the site for housing rare and maybe tough to grow rhododendrons. And so I got some money from the American Rhododendron Society to trial rhododendron species, and we're acquiring basically anything we can get our hands on. This is the hardiness zone map for Ohio. And so here's Lake County, where we're located. And the northern end of the county up by the lake is actually technically in zone 6B, which means that on average, the coldest it's going to get is -5. Of course, we do have those -20 winters, but it only got -4 this year. And last year, I don't think it got below 10. So I think there are opportunities to really push the limits. And one of those great examples of pushing the limits is Steve grew Rhododendron austrinum, the Florida flame azalea, at the station. And then when we got a -24 at the station in 2015, we got flowers. And so what else is maybe rated as not so hardy that might persist or even thrive like Rhododendron austrinum? And so that's what we're really, really excited about. Well, that's what really I'm excited about moving forward with the rhododendron collections at Holden, and having these species collections. A wild occurring species, Rhododendron hypererythrum, was foundational in Steve's program, and so there might be value to the breeding program as well. Moving on to another thing. This is spillover from one of Steve's project. I got in on the tail end of it, but I'm interested in continuing it. Is grafting rhododendrons. the historic purpose for grafting rhododendrons, and we think that grafting could be beneficial to our collections. People would do it historically because it's sometimes rhododendrons are hard to root from a cutting, and so you can graft it instead of rooting, and propagate a plant more easily. So that was the historic approach. But with Steve's Phytophthora program and some of his trials, we've kind of pivoted to grafting maybe for improved adaptability. Because if you, for example, the leech hybrids, there's so many that are just incredibly ornamental and are essentially great plants, except that they're challenging to grow. And so why can't you just put a leech hybrid onto a more adapted rootstock, instead of having to go through all of this effort of breeding a plant that's a well-adapted root system that's, tolerant of these root rot diseases or insects or drought or flooding or salt or high pH, and instead just grafting it so that you don't have to go through 10 years of breeding when the products already exist. And rhododendrons are, I think, kind of special for grafting because you can do this technique called cutting grafting. In other crops, they call it stenting. For example, in roses, they call it stenting. But essentially what you do is you take a stem cutting and it's basically two stem cuttings, and you take the scion, the top part for one, and you tie it, you wound it, and then take the rootstock, which is essentially just a stem cutting, wound it, and then you tie the wounded pieces together, put it under mist for 3 or 4 months, and then you have a rooted cutting that is also grafted. And in practice, we started using the method that the Germans use at Schroeder Nursery, where you slice the full length of your scion and you slice the full length of your rootstock and tie them together and then put it under mist. But what we would run into is that your rootstock and your scion both produce roots. And if you're looking for a plant that has a well-adapted root system, but you have two different root systems occurring at the same time, it kind of defeats the purpose. And so we've pivoted, and we're still using essentially the same technique, but it turns out if you leave a little bit of a gap, so you wound here on your scion, on your rootstock, and you wound here on your scion, tie them together, this area will graft together. Then you leave a tiny bit of space and then wound here and dip in a rooting hormone, and put under mist for 3 to 4 months. You'll get a well-grafted plant with this little bit of space and then roots. And so then you know that your rootstock your roots are entirely from your well-adapted rootstock, and your scion has no roots at all. And so what are the options for rootstocks? There's the historic option, which is Rhododendron ponicum, which people determined is suckers too much. People will graft onto ponicum, and then they'll send up all these suckers, and you're either having to prune them out, or if you're not aware of it, you have a nice pretty rhododendron one year, and then the next year you've got all these purple flowers showing up. Cunningham's white is the industry standard, and probably still is the industry standard, and it roots really well. It's good for grafting. It is susceptible to root rot. And then Steve started this project with these newer rootstocks called Incarho, which is the new-ish kid on the block, though they're a little old. And these are purported to be lime tolerant. They say up to pH 7.5, you can grow rhododendrons grafted onto the Incarho rootstock. There are actually several of them, but we tend to like number 37 the best. And it's a proprietary German rootstock, actually off patent next October. So technically, if you're grafting onto it now, you're breaking the law, though I don't know if anyone would really get you in trouble for it. But next year, they're fair game to use. And it's a cross between Cunningham's white, which is the industry standard rootstock, with a Fortune selection. You don't really know any more details than that. But they say they screened over 1 million seedlings and selected a very, very limited number of them to use as rootstocks. And basically no one in the United States grafts except for this one nursery that's based in Ohio called Decker's Nursery. that supplies grafted plants to other nurseries, but in general, it's a very limited market for grafting. And so with this in mind, Steve started this project to evaluate this claim that it's Lyme tolerant, because if you can graft a rhododendron and onto a Lyme tolerant rootstock, that opens a completely new market for rhododendrons. And so what he, and this is our field station specialist, Jing Wang, did is set up a study where he took ironclads on their own roots and grafted onto the Incarjo rootstock, and then planted them into beds with with pH adjusted soil. So for example, we would have, there's one bed here, one bed here, one bed here, and one bed here. And it would be target pHs of 5, 6, 7, and 8 randomized. And then there would be 5 sets of those. And then within each one of these squares, there would be an ironclad, like Roseum elegans, for example, on its own roots, and then grafted onto Incarjo. And then over time, the thought was just to see how the different plants respond in the different pH treatments. And just as an overarching trend, if on the left side here, you can see on the y-axis, we're measuring a growth rate over time, just how much biomass the plant accumulated. And on the x-axis is pH. And so you can look essentially at low pH. Well, essentially what happens is that at the high pHs, you don't get a lot of biomass accumulation. And essentially what we saw is that there wasn't so much of a pH effect as there was a vigor effect, because these red dots are the self-rooted plants, and these black dots and lines are the grafted plants. And in terms of biomass accumulation over time, the grafted plants just grew so much more than the self-rooted plants. And really, you would expect with good performance as pH goes up, if these Incarjo rootstocks were Lyme tolerant as they are listed to be, you'd expect this black line to, maybe as pH goes up, you'd expect this line to decrease a little, or stay the same or even go up. But instead, they all just declined, basically, maybe even worse than the self-rooted plants. And so the gist is that these Incarjo rootstock, the Incarjo rootstock studied in Steve's study, didn't seem to confer Lyme tolerance, but it did have this vigor component. So these grafted plants grew faster as opposed to the self-rooted plants. And so that was really interesting to us. And in the study, another thing that kind of came out of that study is that we did have Phytophthora disease pressure, but we noticed is that a lot of these Incarjo grafted plants seemed to show some resistance to root rot. And so you've got vigor and potentially root rot resistance, maybe not Lyme tolerance. And taking it a step further, Steve did some greenhouse inoculations, and Roseum elegans here and Cunningham's white here are both known susceptible to root rot. Incarjo was a bit of an unknown, but clearly there's at least some resistance going on here. And so we're really interested in Incarjo, maybe not for the Lyme tolerance that says that's supposed to be there, though we didn't detect it. But there is a vigor effect, and there is a root rot resistance effect that has us excited. And going a step further, in our Lower Baldwin Holden Arboretum trial site, there were these pairs of Capistrano, which is another known susceptible plant, grafted onto Encarjo, and then on its own roots. And essentially in every pair, the own-rooted plant died, and the grafted plant, their grafted plant is doing quite well and is still doing quite well. And so it seems like Encarjo could really give a boost to a lot of these hybrids out there that maybe don't do so well on their own roots, but might do so well grafted. And so then that got us thinking, well, Encarjo seems like a great rootstock, but it is proprietary. And so what else is out there that we could potentially use for grafting? And with Steve's program, there's Rhododendron hyperetherum, which is heat tolerant, root rot resistant. He also has many first generation hybrids with Rhododendron hyperetherum that also might make good rootstocks. And then just in going along with the Phytophthora program, Steve screened a English Roseum, which is another ironclad type plant. And it turned out that English Roseum, at least the Holden accession of English Roseum, showed some resistance to Phytophthora. And so potentially that could be a viable rootstock. And and of course it's an ironclad, which are known for their vigor already. And so that's like maybe an open source, non-proprietary rootstock. And so these are some grafts that we did prior to this fall, so a little over a year and a half ago. And so in fall of 2019, we grafted these, and then what we'll do is put it in a heated greenhouse with our seedlings and grow them through the winter. And then by summer, they were this big, less than a year old. I mean, that's a saleable size plant, if only they were budded. And that's all grafted onto English Roseum. And so it's another rootstock that we're excited about. And really the challenge is how do you get the industry to embrace it? Because otherwise it's just a great idea that's sitting there, and it could really help out rhododendrons. But at the very least, we're going to be using it for the Holden rhododendron collections. This is Capistrano and Red Sea, both grafted onto English Roseum, less than a year old. And so with that, I'd just like to talk about some new plants. That's so Steve's. These are we actually have two siblings that are set for introduction coming up. This we filed a patent for in 2020. This is part of Steve's early efforts for root rot resistance using Ingrid Melquist, which he mentioned in his talk earlier, and Rio, which is a leech hybrid. Just these incredibly floriferous, pink fading to white buds, compact, and demonstrated field resistance to root rot. Just exceptional. And these are coming, this will be coming out of Briggs Nursery. Not exactly sure how soon, but I know that they're starting to build up numbers, and these should certainly be good for you. They're good for us. And then a sibling of it, which is a little further behind, but we also think will be on the market soon. It's kind of it's essentially the same plant, but with a raspberry red flower instead of a pink fading to white flower. Just really nice plants. And then I haven't even told Steve about this, but I just heard yesterday or Friday that Briggs Nursery wants to move forward with 3 more of our hybrids. So I think in the coming years, we're going to have a whole set of root rot resistant Ohio trialed rhododendrons on the market, and all out of the Leach Station breeding program. And with that, of course, I'd like to thank the whole crew of people that help with everything. Steve gave me some slides for the presentation, and he sent me this one, but he wasn't in it. So here's Steve with his thunder, and here's the whole crew. It takes a big effort and a lot of people to help us accomplish what we wanted. And so we have a great group of volunteers, and Jing is field station specialist, helping us get work done at the station. So thank you for the invitation. It's great meeting everyone. And I think Steve and I are happy to take any questions now.
David Taylor, just a comment. I got a Splendor, I guess it was 2 years ago at one of the ARS meetings. I don't remember if it was a auction plant or not, but I was really impressed with the spike before the flower, of the spike coming out for the flower, how dark blood red it was. The flowers were beautiful too, and it really blew nicely this year. And I'm in Yorktown, Virginia, and I have trouble with rhododendrons. And while we have quite a few in the rhododendron garden, two mature Carolines just up and died this year. Just
All right, I'd like to make a comment, and that's I'm rhododendron challenged. I'm about 20 miles from Athens, Georgia, and had just acquired some additional property next door. So anyway, with that, I received, just to let you know, I received 21 splendors from plugs from tissue culture about 18 to 24 months ago. And the purpose is to grow them out for the 2023 convention. And that one didn't make it right away, but the other 20 are doing very well. Not as vigorous as I had hoped that they'd be. They remind me of Yaku Angel that I also have, in that there seem to be short internodes and so forth, and haven't bloomed. So I'm really glad to see a picture of the blooms. And you know, I'm looking forward to growing them out for the next couple of years for the 2023 convention. Let's see. On that, I do have a couple of John Thorntons that I got through several other people, and they seem to be doing fairly well. So, but anyway, my problem is not cold tolerance, but it's heat tolerance. So I've got 225 acres that I'm landscaping here 20 miles from Athens, Georgia. So if you ever want to trial anything heat tolerance, just give me a call.
Okay. Well, yeah, Dale, I think those were, so those were Briggs tissue cultured plants that we got, and we sent some of those to you as plugs, like little 2.5 inch plugs.
Yes.
So,
yeah.
So what size? And that was that 2 seasons ago, or?
I believe I was trying to think myself, but they're I put them into trade gallons, and they're ready to be shifted up now. But they're you know, I wasn't certain how sun tolerant they were and so forth. So they're under an oak canopy and doing fairly well. I'd say one died off early, but the other 20 are healthy and doing well. We with our climate, we had an early spring, but then 2 days before Easter, it dropped down to 30 degrees or so, and you know, it hurt some, but they seem to be doing fairly well.
Okay. Well, if they're not budded by 2023, we're in trouble.
Well, I believe there were some buds on them whenever I looked. They haven't opened up and bloomed yet, but they have put out, you know, some of the vegetative buds are doing well. I want to mention to you that I acquired, this was over 10 years ago, some Catabians for salt. And that is one that is doing extremely well for me. I have a couple that I got early on that are up 10 feet tall and 8 feet wide.
Wow.
So that's my go-to. I propagate 300 to 400 of those a year for my own use. But just to let you know that, you know, they do quite well down here, both growing and then also for propagation. So, you know, I just throw that out.
Yeah, well, we should keep in touch. I'm just interested to learn, you know, how people are doing with those in propagation, especially in warm climates, because it's been, I know growers in the deep south have had trouble growing in containers, black containers in the south can be really problematic. And so PDSI is, I think, shifting most of their growing up further, not in Alabama or Louisiana, but maybe Georgia, North Carolina, which is more favorable to the production. So yeah, well, anyway, maybe I'll bug you for some pictures or updates along the way.
Sure. I have some from Palmer in North Carolina that he gave me, and then I've taken a lot of cuttings, and I'm into propagation, so I've planted out probably 500 rooted cuttings in the last couple of years, and
Okay.
some of them are starting to bloom now. So I'm I'm pleased so far, but I do have to worry about the selections. So, but thank you.
Sure. Well, thank you.
I've been very impressed with how long your splendor has lasted. The flowers are going on 3 weeks now.
Yeah.
And that's really
Wow.
unusual for rhododendrons in our area because we've had some really hot days.
I'm kind of surprised. What are you doing to them?
It's sitting in a pot right out in front of the house in full sun.
All right, well, that's great.
I've been
Good
trying
to
to keep the
know.
deer off it.
I mean, I noticed early on when I was working with David Leach that, he would always be rubbing flowers with his fingers. And I learned that, breeders are looking for kind of heavy substance, that kind of waxy, which may translate into, longevity. So that's something we are usually trying to select for. I know Splendor has some of that anyway, but 3 weeks, wow.
Yeah.
Great.
Mine's under, David Taylor, mine's under a pine canopy in the ground. I planted it after I got it, and it bloomed for at least 3 weeks, and there's still a pretty good bloom on it at the
Okay.
current time. It started down and out, but it's doing well.
Good. I wanted to ask Dick and Jenny if their Splendor
Yes.
ever.
You're muted.
No, I'm not.
Yeah.
It's doing just fine, Steve. I don't know
Okay.
whether it's 3 weeks, but it's at least 2 weeks.
Okay, good.
In the ground.
Excellent. Well, okay, more people have it than I thought.
Yep.
Yes, Ann.
Steve Bernardi here. One of the things I'm impressed about hyperethrum hybrids is leaf retention. They don't drop their leaves after 2 years, at least on some of the things I've seen, like Road Socks and Roadworks and a few others that I've seen. How do your hybrids stand up with the leaf retention? You see, you see more than 2 or 3 years of growth, leaves on them?
What do you think, Connor?
What I would say is that I think the compact habit kind of even if I don't really know if I know, but I think the compact habit kind of masks any poor leaf retention because they're just all stacked on top of each other.
But if you grow them out for several years, you just count the leaves and how many leaves going back to the different growth worlds on the whole thing.
I would, I would say easily 2 years, which is good enough.
Like I said, I've seen more. I've seen more on them.
I mean, yaks, I think, are famous for maybe 3 years retention, or I don't know if it's at that level or not, but those would be really unshaded leaves at that age.
Mm.
So, I don't know if they would persist.
Okay.
I
Ann.
think the convention in Atlanta should be a real awakening and a real occasion that people in the East, particularly, who should look forward to, especially after what we've been going through for the last year and a half or so with the what do you want to call it? Just the COVID that we've been suffering through. So I'm delighted to hear what you're saying because it really makes me excited that we've moved to an apartment rather than having a big garden that we can continue to work with.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. It looks, I guess, yeah. Well, I'm looking forward to 2023 and hopefully 22. Looks like 21 is going to be a wash, but and we did send some splendors up to them, and hopefully they'll get dispersed around the Canadian provinces a bit.
Right. Okay. We're going to be leaving now. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye. You're
Thank
welcome.
you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Uh-huh. Bye-bye.
Steve, I got a question. Do you have any rhododendrons that you're developing that maybe have a nasty taste to them with the deers?
I don't know if there's such a thing exists. It's we finally had to resort to a deer fence around the leach station. When I first started, maybe the first decade or two, it was just kind of a low-level nuisance, and then it was like they developed a taste for it or something, and it got really bad. But
Maybe you could cross them with liquid fence.
yeah, right. Or maybe we just need a soil drench you can have that the plant takes up.
Need to implant the garlic gene.
Cross them with honey locust.
Well, very good presentation by everybody. We're very thankful for that.
I agree. I agree.
Yes.
Well done.
Yes.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Thanks.
Very
Thank
good.
you all for
Coming.
having us, and to Teresa and Debbie and David in particular for taking care of the details.
Yeah, and if you're ever in the area, feel free to reach out. I'll show you around the gardens.
Maybe you organize another convention up there, like it's as good as the last one.
There you go.
Well, we'll see if our chapter is muscular enough to do that.
Yeah. Anybody who hasn't registered for 2021 yet, there's still room.
Yeah.
Nobody's
Are you
ready.
saying that dryly, or yeah?
Hey, it's underrepresented so far.
Okay.
There's a lot of room left.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
You're off camera.
Yeah.
register if you haven't.
There's going to be some good speakers. So thinking of that, David, is that something that they can record?
It will be recorded, yes.
Yeah,
It will be
terrific.
recorded. I think people have gradually gotten the idea, remembering to hit the record button for all Zoom presentations. Then you've got the possibility of a program or something.
Right, right.
But that one's we had a short session with their organizers and met their tech, and I think they've actually hired her because she's obviously a real expert. So
Good.
there should be no bugs or glitches short of internet down or something like that. So should be really well done.
Great.
Very good.
Good.
Well, I would
Well, is it time to
definitely like-
refill our glasses?
Well, first, I'd like to thank both you and Connor. It was really an interesting presentation, and I'm looking forward to seeing some of those new introductions. I hope I last long enough.